And speaking of Martin Luther King, we've heard for a while now from Glenn Beck his rhetoric about comparing himself to Martin Luther King, and in all the wrong ways, by the way. And I have a clip here where he is essentially doing the same thing. Here's Glenn Beck addressing Martin Luther King Day. I want you to listen very closely to exactly what he says, because if you just do a cursory analysis of what Glenn Beck is telling us, you'll find out, not surprisingly, reality is the exact opposite, 180 degrees different, or if you're Sarah Palin, 360 degrees different as to what is being presented.
So here they are, blaming Martin Luther King. They're blaming him for the violence. That's the opposite of what he was. But this is the establishment. This is the elitist view. Is what they wanted to print at the time. That was the script. So it didn't matter. It didn't matter what people were seeing on TV. It was clearly not Martin Luther King's fault. It might have been Malcolm X, not related to the Martin Luther King movement. It was not William Ayers. I mean, William Ayers was doing it, but William Ayers wasn't connected to Martin Luther King. Black Panthers, not King. But that didn't matter to the media. The media just stuck to what was previously written because the elites had their story.
Okay, so let me explain this to you in as simple terms as I can, because it's so bizarre and embarrassing that Glenn Beck is even doing this. The comparison that's being made is that similar to how Glenn Beck is being blamed by the media for connections to real-world violence, Martin Luther King was wrongly blamed for connections to real-world violence, for inciting real-world violence, right? The thing is, number one, at face value, it's completely absurd and it is a worthless comparison. But let's actually examine it for what it is. The violence that actually accompanied the Martin Luther King civil rights marches were called race riots. And they were assaults by angry conservative whites on the black marchers. So that's the violence that these editorialists in Chicago were absurdly blaming Martin Luther King for. Do you see what's going on here, Lewis? It's being reversed in an insulting and absurd way.
Intentionally?
Glenn Beck has to know that the violence that was attributed to Martin Luther King was violence on Martin Luther King and his people by those who were against the civil rights movement.
Or is he talking about violence by black groups that had nothing to do with Dr. King?
Listen, I don't know what Glenn Beck is implying.
I'm not really sure what he's implying either.
But the people who were attacking King viciously and violently were conservatives, and the people who supported him and marched with him were the progressives. So to say that the liberal media and people like Bill Ayers are all wrapped up in this is incredible. This is the epitome of propaganda, and it's so carefully delivered with the video in the background and all of that stuff. And we have some King propaganda, actually, that you can even put up on the screen. Do you think Glenn Beck believes this? And it just happens to be compelling because visually Fox does a good job? Or do you think that Glenn Beck knows this is completely bogus, it's the opposite of reality, and he's just trying to be interesting?
We've been asking ourselves if Glenn Beck actually believes anything he says for years, right?
Right.
I don't know.
I guess it's not clear.
No. It's certainly good for ratings.
Although they are not what they once were. I really hope that the audience understands what is being the incredible inaccuracy, the fundamental inaccuracy that in some way is easy to gloss over when you hear, well, Martin Luther King was incorrectly accused of inciting violence and Glenn Beck was incorrectly accused of inciting violence. When Martin Luther King was the recipient of violence, the violence followed him because people didn't want civil rights. I hope that it's clear to people. DavidPakman.com/secret. It's an audience only. We're not publishing it anywhere on our social media or website or anywhere else. Discounted monthly or yearly membership rates. DavidPakman.com/secret. Let's take a break. We'll be back with plenty more after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.